So welcome. Today's call is called Meditation and Creativity. And it's a topic I'm excited to share with you about. And I think it will bring some interesting perspectives to the practice, both the practice of meditation and creativity. So I'd like to start by simply posing the question, what is creativity? When we say that someone is creative, what are we saying? When we watch a movie or see a painting or a play or a dance performance, and we say it was creative, what is it that we are pointing to? What is the quality that is creativity? And I would say that when we speak about creativity, we're speaking about originality. We're speaking about the capacity to catalyze and generate something original, something novel, something spontaneous, something that does not have precedent. Something that is more than putting together pieces that already exist. It's a creation of something out of nothing. And if we look into the nature of creativity and the nature of consciousness, we will find that the practice of meditation gives us access to greater creative potential and to profound creative potential. So first, to speak a little bit about our general condition. Generally, we all tend to be captivated. Our attention tends to be captivated by understanding and the seeking for understanding. And when I speak about understanding, what I mean is understanding is the stories that we have about things that tell us what they mean. It's the story that goes along with our life as we live it. We live life and we're constantly generating stories about life that are explaining to us what the events of our lives mean, what the objects that appear in our lives mean, what the people who appear in our lives mean to us. It's like an ongoing narration to our life that we are generating. And this kind of inner talk, which the currency of which is language, captures a great deal of our attention and often is what we think of when we think about knowing. Knowing we think of as knowing about things. It's knowing stories about things that are true. So I have a story about the sun. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. That's a story that I believe is telling me the truth about the sun. And if you look into your experience, you will see that we live in a world created of stories on top of stories on top of stories on top of stories that tell us about the world and how it works, about each other and how we work. And that narration, which exists as inner dialogue in our minds, is captured, is held in language. Even when we talk about feelings and emotions, a great deal of what we commonly imagine to be feelings are also bound up in stories about the feeling and about what the feeling means. Our stories about things and the things themselves have become somewhat hopelessly intertwined, and so that we have become deeply bound up in language. And most language is not very creative. Most language is repetition of things that have already been put in language, things that have already been said. At its best, language is reconfiguring, which means it takes previous ideas, either other people's or our own, and it reconstructs them in new ways, and there is a certain novelty in that, in a new synthesis of previously imagined ideas. But as long as we remain limited to the domain of language and understanding, then very little creativity is possible. It puts narrow constraints on the possibility of creativity, because you can only be creative with what has already been understood and has already been put into language. Creativity, I would say, doesn't originate in language, though. It resides in a domain of what I would call spontaneous insight, or what is more commonly called intuition. Now, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet, who was a great influence on one of my philosophical heroes, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American poet, drew a distinction between understanding and reason. Emerson later changed the terminology and made a distinction between understanding and intuition. And intuition is a kind of spontaneous knowing. It's a knowing that emerges before thought, before language. And it comes not from some synthesis of previous ideas, but sort of straight into existence. So I want to share with you a story that relates all this to meditation in my own experience. It's a story about being on retreat. It was the first powerful meditation experience I ever had. I was on a retreat, and until that time, I found meditation very difficult. I'd been meditating for about 3 years, but I really was mostly just trying not to fall asleep, because in meditation I tended to just fall asleep. And the instructions that I had been given for meditation were to let everything be as it is. And I sat down in one meditation determined that I was going to finally follow those instructions seriously for the entire hour. And so I went through a process where thoughts would arise, feelings would arise. I would feel myself getting caught up in them. I would realize I was caught up in them. I would, let go of them, push them away, and then realize I was caught in the next thought or the next feeling, and I would move away from that one. I would let go of that one, and then another one, and then another one, and then another one. And what happened was, as I was giving myself to this practice of letting everything be as it is, which for me at this time meant letting go of each thought or feeling once I realized I was captured in it, the thoughts and feelings seemed to be coming faster and faster and faster and faster. And I felt like I couldn't keep up with the letting go. In fact, I started to actually panic. I started to physically shake, and my throat started to sort of open and close. And at some point I realized this, I'm terrified that something bad is going to happen, but I'm just sitting here in meditation. Nothing bad could possibly happen. And so in the midst of this bodily panic and my effort to let everything be as it is, I just relaxed and I let go. And something extraordinary happened. The source of my awareness, the place that I was looking from, and this is the best I can describe it. It just slipped out of my mind and sort of out through the back of my head, so that I was now looking from some place behind myself. And what I realized I was looking at was my mind. And at least as well as memory serves, what my mind looked like was a beehive of thought and feeling all swarming around each other. And I was somehow outside of it now. I was consciously aware, but outside of my mind, looking back at my mind. And I found it amazing. I could see how the mind works. I could see that there are all these thoughts that either I generated in the past, or that my culture had generated, or that people had told me, and they were all swirling around, there to be paid attention to at will. But that new thoughts, none of those thoughts ever became a new thought. None of them ever gave birth to a new thought. But somehow new thoughts just spontaneously appeared as if out of nowhere. And what I realized was that thinking isn't really something you can do. You can't construct a thought. You simply bear witness to the thoughts arising, which is what the experience of intuition is. And that what I typically thought of as thinking is often paying attention to certain thoughts that are in the general vicinity that I'm looking for a new thought. And in the midst of paying attention to thoughts I previously had on the same subject, occasionally a new thought would just pop into existence. And so I was aware that something spontaneous happens that is the real creation of thoughts or feelings. And I don't want to call them thoughts and feelings. I want to call them sensations, which means they arise as sensations, not yet either thought or feeling. Some kind of mind impulse that arises, and then almost immediately some kind of a story gets wrapped around it. Maybe the story is a story about the fact that it's a feeling and what the feeling means, and that it means I'm sad, and then a story about why I'm sad and who made me sad and how I can get happy. Or maybe it's some other story. But almost immediately upon its arising, a story wraps around the sensation. And we've become so habitually fixated on the stories that many of us don't have nearly as much direct access to the creative, spontaneous emergence of mind that is always at the heart of the creative process. The capacity of consciousness to spontaneously generate sensations is the source of creativity. Now, in meditation, one way to think about meditation is that we simply stop paying attention to the story. Our mind will continue to create a story. It's a constant narration of what's happening and why it's happening and what it means. But we don't have to pay attention to the story. We can allow the narrator to keep speaking, the mind to keep telling us things, to keep talking to us without paying any attention to it. And if you stop paying attention to the story that's being narrated by your mind, you will start to lose interest in the story. It will stop mattering to you what your mind thinks it understands about everything. And you will realize that your mind's understanding, which is rooted in language, is limited. And that a great deal more is possible. A great deal more is available to be experienced and to be known in a new way than the mind will ever know. And this is what you experience in deep meditation, that there is a knowing, a form of knowing, a way of knowing that is beyond and outside of the mind. It's a direct knowing, a witnessing of creation at its source, at the inception of an impulse, of a sensation. And so one way to think about meditation is that it is the practice of letting go of the mind's narration and the mind's story. So that you can slip out beyond what it's possible for the mind to know and experience an awareness of reality that's unfiltered by the mind and the mind's ideas. A place that we could call pure imagination, pure ability to imagine. And personally, I just think that there is so much need for change in our world that the ability to imagine new possibilities needs to be increased dramatically. One of the challenges of our time is that more change is needed than most of us have the capacity to imagine is possible. And letting go of the mind's stories and the mind's limitations is how we expand our capacity for imagination, our capacity to intuit new possibilities directly that haven't already been filtered through the limiting ideas of the mind. And so with that, I want to lead us into a guided meditation. So if you would sit back wherever you are, and the instruction will be to simply not pay attention to the story, to any story that your mind might be telling you. Anytime you notice that you are paying attention to a story, whatever the story is, and it doesn't matter what, It could be a story about how well you're meditating or how poorly you're meditating. It could be a story about some of the ideas I just shared with you. It could be a story about something that happened this morning or yesterday, or something you are looking forward to or fearing that might happen tomorrow. It really doesn't matter what the story is about as soon as you recognize that you are paying attention to a story. Which will almost certainly mean as soon as you recognize that you are paying attention to language in the form of some voice in your head that is talking to you and telling you a story, you simply let it go. And you put your attention somewhere where there is no story, where there is no part of your mind telling you anything about what's happening. There is a difference between not paying attention to the stories that your mind is telling you and stopping your mind from telling stories. You can't stop your mind from telling stories. Your mind is a collection of stories. Stories about life. Stories about you. Stories about everything and everyone that you know. There's no need to stop your mind from telling stories. You simply need to stop paying attention to the stories. Imagine that your mind is like a planet. And when you pay attention to that planet. You are locked in its orbit. Your gaze is fixed upon it. But when you stop paying attention, when you stop staring down at the planet below you, you begin to float free of orbit. You begin to turn and face the vast expanse of space beyond. Beyond the world of mind is a vast, limitless expanse of consciousness. And it is possible for us to know out there. It's just that the knowing comes in a different form. From the point of view of the mind, the knowing that happens in the expanse of pure awareness is invisible. So as you sit, not paying attention to the stories of the mind, be open to the possibility of experiencing an invisible, mysterious knowing. A knowing that has been called intuition. It's been called revelation. It is a knowing that spontaneously arises in the eye of the mind. our training in mind has been so heavily biased toward understanding about things that the habit of seeking understanding in language has become so strong. In meditation, we resist that habit by endeavoring not to pay attention to the stories our mind is telling us. We allow our attention to turn away from the mind and its stories toward the expanse of consciousness that lays beyond. And when we do, we find ourselves floating further from the mind, into the creative adventure of pure consciousness, pure imagination. Watch how quickly your mind turns every experience into a story. Even as you turn away from stories, a story about turning away from stories forms. It's immediate. It's unending. Almost as soon as an experience occurs, a story starts to wrap itself around it. Find a place to put your attention where there is no story, and just let it rest there. Let it comfortably sit in a place in consciousness where there is no story about anything. Where there is just pure awareness. if we have not yet recognized that our stories about reality are not reality itself, then we are bound up and lost in our stories, in our mind's stories about reality. When we realize that those stories are not reality, we have the opportunity to come into direct contact with what is real. And that is one of the great miracles of meditation. And with that, I would like to invite you to end your meditation. And I also would like to invite any questions that people might have about meditation practice, about anything I spoke about just now.
Hi, Jeff. I'm great. I've really been enjoying. I started to practice with your 60-day because I signed up for your 5-day meditation, and I thought, I better get prepared because I've never been a meditator. So I'm doing your 60-day meditation. I love it, and I'm really curious. How do you know the difference between when you're just not thinking anymore and being asleep? Because the other day, it must have been yesterday, Thursday morning, after the 20 minutes, I didn't set an alarm, and I just kept going, and then all of a sudden I heard my computer Skype, my next appointment was calling me, because I had gone like 10 minutes past your 20-minute meditation and had no idea, but it didn't feel like I was asleep. So I'm wondering, when you said that you sleep, how do you know the difference between being asleep and just being like me?
Well, I can tell you how I used to know the difference. My head would bob. You know, I would be sitting and all of a sudden my head would bob, sometimes so hard that I thought it was going to fall off my neck.
Okay, all right. I've experienced that enough times that I know that. Yeah, I know that head bobbing thing.
Right, and my advice about sleeping is, unless you're really like bobbing and falling asleep, or I've even seen people fall off their chair. But I think if you're in a semi-dream state and you're not really sure if it's awake or asleep, endeavor to be as awake and alert as possible whenever you are aware that you're meditating. And don't make a problem out of the fact that you might sometimes be in a state that's not clear to you. Don't make discerning whether you're awake or asleep a project, because then you won't be meditating anymore.
Well, after the fact.
Right.
This was like after the fact. So I wasn't aware of it while it was. I wasn't aware.
Right. Even after the fact, I would let it go. I'll tell you this is my rule for meditation, because I say that in meditation I let everything be as it is during that 20 minutes or an hour or however long it is. But I've made a second rule for myself, which is if I'm going to leave everything as it is during that time, that means during the time and also later as well. Even later, I can't go back and start to pick apart what happened. I just let it be. And I think that's how I would advise you. I mean, you're doing the 60 days. Give it all your heart and earnestness, and follow the instructions that I'm giving, to the best of your ability, and then see what happens. And don't try to understand it and figure it out, even after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
Try that and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, this was helpful today for that.
Good.
Hi, Jeff. How are you today?
Very good. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I did something a little bit different with this meditation, and I want to check it out with you. When I wanted to get beyond the story making of the mind, I sort of spontaneously decided to build in a competing response. So what I was doing was I was creating something for my inner eye to see, which was sort of the color of sand, a very boring color, just a very, very, just a boring color to stare at. And then I filled my ears, instead of with my thoughts, with just the sound of and just let myself hear that sound. And so it gave something to focalize my attention on, both visually and orally. But at first it was difficult to do that, but the more I sank into that experience, just as you called us out of meditation, something began to happen. I don't know what it was, but something began to happen. And I don't know whether that would be what you would recommend or not, but I need to have some kind of fix for my attention. Otherwise, my mind starts flopping around. So I'm just checking that out with you to see.
Well, my general advice would be to just let your mind flop around, and not try to do anything to distract yourself, and just let the mind.
Don't try to hold your attention somewhere.
Right. Don't, because if you're doing anything, then you must think there's something that needs to be done, which means something's not right. And at least the way I'm teaching meditation, I want you to experience the perfection of having no problem, which means it doesn't matter if the mind is flopping around or not flopping around. It's completely irrelevant. Everything is fine anyway. So that's generally what I would advise. And at the same time, I want to also ask you if, in terms of what you were seeing of sand and what you were hearing in terms of the Om, if that was really something you were doing, or if the doing of that was something that was just happening.
No, I was doing it.
Right. So to the extent that you're manufacturing it, I would strongly suggest not manufacturing something. But if something like that just spontaneously starts to happen, then you have to let that be too. The trick is knowing the difference between when we're doing something in some conscious, deliberate way versus when something is just spontaneously happening. Because anything that's spontaneously happening, you just let it be as it is, which includes the mind flopping around. It would include images of sand that you were seeing. It would include sounds of Om. If it's spontaneously emerging, let it be, and don't manufacture anything.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you.
I guess I'll keep this quick. I don't want to get in the way of a question, but I just want to say, first of all, thanks for doing this. This is great. And second, your description of when you had the awakening, when the way you described it was you went behind your head or behind your mind and observed it separately. I've never actually heard anybody explain the same experience that I had. I actually went sort of underneath, but other than that, it was the same exact kind of thing. You seem to sense and pick up on different things than I did. But, I had like the experience of who I was, separate from the last thing that I still thought I might be, which I thought I was my brain.
Right.
That was the hardest thing for me to let go of.
Right. No, I can hear it.
Yeah. And when you were talking about the thought, I forget what you called it, but the something before the thoughts.
Sensation.
I've had, sensation. I've had experience of, I call them impulses, like the impulse of the thought. And I've had experiences of that and like an awareness of the brain sort of taking that impulse and it just expanding out. But my thought had always been that the impulse had all that. And so it was interesting, not to get too intellectual, but it was fascinating to hear your view of it, where to me it's like it's so fast, it's so full of whatever the message is, that impulse. And then the brain has to like translate it into something that, I might be able to get or follow. But the idea that the brain then, perhaps almost instantly wraps a bunch of stories around it and fits it into other things the brain already understands, therefore making it not the initial message.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Exactly, yes. Because
that was,
well, that initial impulse, it's not meaningless. I think it is packed with meaning, but that meaning can be interpreted in many ways. And the mind's job is to, use story to create an interpretation of every impulse that fits in with whatever worldview we're currently holding, so that everything stays sort of internally consistent. And so for those of us who are interested in the possibility of a new paradigm and a new worldview, we need to gain more access to knowing beyond the mind, because the mind will always take every meaningful impulse and translate it into terms that make it fit into the existing paradigm.
And so because I've been in different places, that experience I described was like in 1997, and I've been in different spaces, more so-called spiritual and less so-called spiritual,
Sure.
throughout the time since then. And so just to hear this conversation and to look at this again, it's just a recognition that the more so-called spiritual I am, the more I'm able to take those thoughts and impulses and take them more fully for what they are and not change them so much, and then actually start to become able to act on whatever that impulse is trying to convey to me without my brain poisoning it so much that it has so little of its original meaning left to it that it becomes, unusable almost. So that the more I'm meditate and open up and stuff like that, the more useful that'll be. So
I think you're right on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and great technique. This thing that you said today of turning the mind, that was wonderful. That worked really effectively for me today. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I'm familiar with this method of moving toward consciousness, and I also practice letting things be as they are and not making a problem.
Right.
So my question is, in the practice you're putting us through today, at the point where we notice we have a thought and we're telling the story and wrapping ourselves in that, and we make the effort to shift, it seems like it's trying to control or manipulate the situation. So in a way, this feels very permission-giving, like we can make a choice to either stay with letting things be as they are, which would be heightened awareness, letting the thoughts come up, but keeping some distance from them as a witness. And now we have the choice or permission to say, no, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
I'm going to move toward a purer state of consciousness. Does that fit? Does that fit with what you're teaching us?
It does fit with what I'm teaching. And I would like to say as a caveat that, in the end, we're not really doing anything. And, if we relax and we let everything be as it is and we allow whatever is in consciousness to be there and we don't touch it. See, that's the important thing is we don't get involved with it. Then what naturally wants to happen is that we will shift and turn toward the expanse of consciousness beyond. That's what wants to happen if we aren't distracting ourselves by being constantly fiddling with the mind. Now,
in my practice, that just takes a lot longer.
Exactly.
To happen rather than.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I want to give you permission to experiment a little, because that was
Thank you.
That was valuable to me in my practice, because even with the practice of having no problem, if we're rigid about trying to follow it, we can turn it into a technique that isn't ultimately going to help us find freedom. And so we have to give ourselves a little bit of permission to experiment and, try things and see what happens. And, I've had all kinds of experiments. And when I teach meditation, I like to share the different experiments that I did during, many years of practice because, some worked out, some didn't work out, some worked out in ways I thought they might, and others worked out in ways I couldn't imagine. And as I said, some just didn't work out at all. But I started my adult life as a scientist, and I never quite gave up the impulse for experimentation. So I like to give people permission, to experiment a little.
Something to add to my credentials, science.
That's right.
Scientific orientation. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Jeff. That's helpful. And it's good to talk with you.
Nice to talk to you too.
I'm just questioning I just found myself trying to step away as the thought would come.
Right.
And so is even the try to step away part of letting it be?
Well, in the end,
I just stop myself.
Right. In the end, the effort to step away is that also will go away. Because as I just said to Francis, in the end, if you let everything be as it is and you really, really, really disengage from the mind and you just let it do what it does without you being bothered at all, very naturally you will step away. And very naturally you will turn toward a great expanse of consciousness beyond. So ideally, you don't do anything. And it all happens as a natural process of growth that seems to be the way we're designed. And yet, at different points in your meditation practice, as I was just saying, it can be useful to consciously step away and to consciously make effort. And if you do that earnestly, it will have an effect, and it will bring you closer to the kind of natural awakening that is the ultimate goal.
Okay. I guess I don't yet understand the idea of moving toward consciousness. I'm still trying to figure out what the difference between that and the thoughts and.
Right. Well, in your meditation, keep looking for a place to put your awareness where there isn't any story. And when you find it, you will have found the great expanse of consciousness beyond the mind. There's no stories there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. As you know, I do these calls periodically, and I will do one again soon. And with that, I want to open up all of the lines so that we can say goodbye, and I can thank everyone for coming. Bye now.